Before we begin, write in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. It helps us feel that this Old West story connects with every corner of the planet. The year was 1887. The Copper Benz auction yard in Rawlins, Wyoming, was filled with men watching with a mix of anxiety and greed. Some had come with coins in their pockets, others just for the entertainment of seeing a human being auctioned off. The law in that territory allowed the sale of indigenous prisoners as if they were cattle. And although many stayed silent, everyone knew that behind this legal business lay abuse, violence, and shattered lives. Amid the cigar smoke and the morning chill, the crowd focused on a single figure, a young Apache woman named Kana standing on the wooden platform. Her buckskin dress was torn, showing the harshness of the treatment she had received. Her wrists still bore fresh marks from the ropes used to drag her from the river. Despite everything, she kept her back straight and her gaze steady, refusing to lower her head before the men who desired her as property. The sheriff, a 58-year-old veteran, watched in silence from the side. He knew he couldn't intervene. The auction, though inhumane, was protected by territorial law, yet his hand rested near his revolver. Over the years, he had learned to read the tension of a crowd, and something in the air told him this day would not end without conflict. Among those present was Beckett Shaw, a 41-year-old rancher who had come to town with simple intentions, to buy nails, wire, and some grease for his wagon. A bounty hunter during the war, Beckett carried physical and emotional scars. He had sworn to stay out of others' problems, live quietly on his ranch, and focus only on what was necessary to survive. But that day, hearing the auctioneer's voice and seeing Kana on the platform, something stirred within him. He recognized in the woman's gaze a silent resistance, the same he had felt years ago when life had backed him into a corner. The crowd murmured, shouted numbers, laughed as if choosing horses instead of human beings. Then Beckett raised his hand and offered an amount too high to be taken as a joke, yet manageable enough to prevail. Silence fell over the yard immediately. No one else dared risk money on what was merely a passing spectacle to them. The auctioneer's hammer fell. Beckett didn't celebrate or move arrogantly. He simply received the purchase document, which with cold indifference didn't even bear the woman's name. Reading it, his anger surged. They treated her like an object without identity. With a dry gesture, he tore the paper in two and let the pieces fall to the ground. His voice, deep and firm, was clear. "Are you coming with me?" There were no chains, no forced contact, no words of possession, only a direct instruction, spoken low enough for those who needed to hear it. Kiona watched him carefully. She saw the gray in his temples, the battle marks on his face, the posture of someone who had carried burdens yet still stood. She didn't detect the usual signs of a dangerous man in him. There were no leering smiles, no eyes fixed on her body, no restless hands. If anything, there was something different, a strange calm amidst the uproar. The sheriff stepped forward. With a neutral voice, he warned, "Keep the peace." It was a caution, but also a tacit permission for Beckett to take her away without opposition. The men who had captured Kiona shifted uncomfortably, but seeing the sheriff's hand on his revolver, they chose not to provoke further. Kiona stepped down from the platform without accepting the feigned help of a young man who extended his hand only to appear courteous. She walked with dignity toward the exit. Beckett stayed by her side, shielding her from murmurs and stares. In his mind, the plan was simple: get her on a horse, take her to his ranch, and let her decide what to do with her freedom. The crowd slowly parted to let them pass, not out of respect, but because the sheriff's gesture and Beckett's seriousness made it clear that intervening would mean looking for trouble. As they moved away, a man muttered an insult, but with a single cold look from Beckett, the words died in his mouth. For Kana, this moment wasn't full liberation. It was merely an opportunity, an open door. Her immediate goal was clear: leave that place with her head high, hold on to her name, and figure out who the man who had paid for her truly was, not as an owner, but as a stranger seemingly determined to give her something more valuable than any freedom written on paper, the possibility to choose. Beckett and Kiona walked through the crowd, which, though it parted, kept their eyes fixed on them. The silence was strange. Minutes earlier, everyone had been shouting prices. Now no one dared to step in their way. Beckett felt each step as a test. If anyone came close to touching her, he knew he would have to react without a second thought. The sheriff remained still at the edge of the auction yard, watching the two make their way through. When he saw a couple of ranchers tense their shoulders with the intent to provoke, he made his message clear by resting his hand on the butt of his revolver. The gesture was enough to defuse the threat. The sheriff wasn't a hero, but he wasn't a man to be disrespected without consequence. Upon reaching the horses, Beckett acted calmly, loosening his mount's reins and preparing the spare mare he had brought for supplies. Without a word, he handed Kiona a wool coat and a canteen. There were no formalities or theatrical gestures, only concrete actions to let her know she wasn't facing another man seeking to subdue her. Kiona, without exaggerated gratitude, accepted the coat and mounted the horse with the skill of someone who had ridden many times. Beckett noted the detail. This woman knew how to move in open terrain. What she had suffered in the past hours hadn't robbed her of the ability of an Apache raised among horses and rivers. For the road, Beckett said in a dry voice, also handing her a piece of bread and dried meat. Kiona took it silently. The journey began amidst a tense atmosphere. Each was occupied with their own thoughts. Beckett calculated the route, mentally reviewed whether men from town might try to follow them, and kept an eye on the horizon. Deep inside, however, one thought repeated itself. He hadn't planned this. The money he carried was for nails and wire, not to buy a life. But at the same time, he knew that even if he had wanted to ignore the auction, he wouldn't have slept peacefully afterward. Kiona, for her part, focused on breathing, on analyzing every gesture of the man ahead. She noticed he never turned to look at her maliciously, nor made sudden moves to impress her. He stayed half a step away, shielding without confining. It was a behavior she hadn't seen in the men who had captured her. It sparked a different kind of suspicion in her. Was it genuine prudence or a temporary strategy? When they were far enough from town and the auction sounds faded, Beckett slowed the horses, stopped by a thin ice-covered stream, and turned to her. "Let me see your wrists," he said. Kiona looked at him distrustfully. She didn't let her guard down. She assessed the distance to the water, to the horses, to his revolver. Only when she confirmed he kept his palms open without a single movement that could be misinterpreted did she slowly extend her hands. Beckett removed his gloves and took a small jar of ointment from his pocket. "I use it in winter for cracked hands," he explained as he carefully applied the salve to the red marks left by the rope. Kiona watched him from the corner of her eye. She expected at any moment his gaze to drop to the torn neckline of her dress, but it didn't. The man focused solely on the wound. That detail, so small yet so unusual, was enough to make her breathing become slightly less tense. They shared a quick meal, a piece of bread, some dried meat, a bit of metallic-tasting water from the canteen. There were no words of thanks or attempts at forced conversation. Both knew that at that moment conserving strength and moving forward was what mattered most. When they mounted again, Kiona dared to ask her first question, more strategic than curious. "Where are you taking me?" Beckett held his gaze toward the horizon without turning to her. "To my ranch, about 12 miles from here. You'll have a roof, food, and a door you alone can decide to close or not. No one owes you anything, and you owe me nothing." The answer disconcerted her. She was used to hearing orders disguised as favors. This instead sounded like a practical promise, a proposal with no hidden conditions. Kiona then allowed herself the question that most troubled her. "Did that paper you tore up do any good?" Beckett tightened the reins and took a deep breath before answering. "The paper was just a formality. What counts is that I paid in front of everyone with the sheriff and the clerk as witnesses. No one can say you're someone's property. If they try, we'll discuss it before the law with names and witnesses, not in an auction yard." For the first time since she had been captured, Kiona felt her thoughts could go beyond surviving the next minute. She didn't fully trust him yet, but she had gained something important, a margin to plan her own future. The road to the ranch continued under a clear sky, the horses setting a steady pace. Kiona mentally reviewed every word he had said, as if testing their solidity. And inside her, an inevitable conclusion emerged. Maybe this stranger hadn't bought her life. Maybe he had bought her time to decide what to do with it. The sun was slowly setting when the horses began to show signs of fatigue. Beckett knew the roads around Rawlins well and knew that to reach his ranch without trouble, he should stop at a strategic point to rest for a few hours. He chose a clearing surrounded by young pines, open enough for visibility, with water nearby and space for a campfire without drawing too much attention. Kiona dismounted without waiting for instructions. She tied the reins firmly to a low branch, then stepped back a few paces, watching Beckett cautiously. She didn't trust him enough to relax, but neither did she show fear. It was clear she retained an intact sense of independence. Beckett unloaded the saddlebags and began preparing the fire. His hands moved with precision, like someone who had repeated the gesture hundreds of times on campaigns and solitary journeys. In his mind, he reviewed what he knew of Apache customs. They were nomads, experts at reading the land, resilient hunters, and wary of anything resembling forced compassion. If he wanted peace with Kiona, he would have to offer deeds, not words. When the first flame lit the night, he handed Kiona a piece of dried meat and an improvised bowl of hot coffee. There was no conversation, only direct actions. She accepted without lowering her gaze, like someone measuring every detail of the person before her. The tension broke when Beckett, without adornment, said, "You can sleep without fear. I'll keep watch." Kiona raised an incredulous eyebrow. He had heard too many promises before, almost all broken. Yet the way he said it wasn't like someone trying to convince her, but like a man stating what was going to happen with the same certainty as announcing the sunrise. "And why would I trust you?" she asked, with a tone mixing challenge and curiosity. Beckett didn't answer right away. He took a long sip from his coffee cup and finally replied, "You can't, but you can observe. Tomorrow you'll have more proof than today." The answer surprised Kiona. It wasn't the typical line of a man seeking quick trust. It was almost a statement of principle. Deeds will speak louder than words. Silence returned. Only the crackle of the fire and the murmur of the nearby stream could be heard. In that atmosphere, Kiona lay down, resting her back against a tree with the coat he had given her and the small knife she had managed to hide in the seam of her dress. She wasn't sleeping trusting, she was sleeping ready. Beckett, sitting by the fire, dedicated himself to watching the surroundings. He didn't just look for animals or bandits, he also paid attention to the wind direction, the stars in the sky, and any sign that they might be followed. Experience had taught him that the forest's calm could change in seconds. Hours later, as the moon reached its zenith, Kiona's eyes snapped open. It wasn't due to a loud noise, but a feeling. She saw Beckett still awake, leaning against a log with his rifle loaded across his knees. He didn't seem exhausted, drunk, or distracted, just a man on guard, doing exactly what he said. At that moment, for the first time since her capture, Kiona allowed herself to close her eyes without the sensation of being attacked at any second. It wasn't absolute trust, but it was a first real rest. Beckett noticed the gesture. He didn't smile, change his posture, or seek satisfaction in what he had achieved. He simply kept his guard. For him, this wasn't an achievement, but a basic obligation. If he had decided to take her from the auction, he had to follow through with what that choice entailed. At dawn, as the first rays of light filtered through the trees, Kiona woke and found him in the same position. Beckett barely moved his hat to shield his eyes from the sun, as if the all-night vigil hadn't worn him down. That detail, a man who did exactly what he said without exaggeration or excuses, was what began to sow an unexpected idea in her. Perhaps this stranger was not like the others. Morning brought a cold air descending from the mountains. Beckett stood, stretched his shoulders, and extinguished the fire with dirt and stream water. Kiona, who had slept with one eye open, watched him silently. She noticed something in his movements, not rushed but not careless either. It was the discipline of someone used to surviving outside the comforts of home. They mounted again and resumed the path toward the ranch. For the first few miles, no one spoke. Beckett kept his eyes forward, alert to any shadows on the trails. Kiona, in contrast, alternated her gaze between the horizon and this man who had so far kept his word. He didn't try to fill the silence with promises, didn't seek to impose himself, just moved forward. Finally, she broke the silence. "Do you always live alone?" The question sounded innocent, but had a clear underlying intent. Kiona didn't want to know about his loneliness. She wanted to know who she would have to contend with if she reached that ranch. Beckett understood immediately. "Yes, no wife, no children, just me and the land I work." Kiona paused for a few seconds. She wasn't sure if that answer brought relief or distrust. A lone man could be less complicated or much more dangerous. The trail led them along a path winding between low hills. Beckett slowed when he saw fresh tracks in the soil, boot prints, not animal. He crouched, analyzed the direction, then stood with a frown. "We're not the only ones who passed through here last night." His tone wasn't alarming but left no room for doubt. Kiona understood this could mean the men from the auction had decided to follow them. Her body tensed immediately. Beckett turned to her. "If so, they won't want to fight in the open. They'll try to catch us when we're distracted." He handed her a small pistol, a short-barreled Colt. "You can shoot, right?" Kiona took the weapon without hesitation and checked it with the confidence of someone who had used guns before. She gripped it firmly and tucked it into her improvised belt. She didn't need to say anything. Her gesture was enough to show that, if necessary, she could defend herself. They resumed their journey, this time with a different air. They were no longer just a rancher and an Apache woman heading to an uncertain destination. Now they shared a common responsibility, staying alive. Hours later, the ranch appeared in the distance, in the middle of an open plain. A simple wooden house, a horse corral, and a small stable. It wasn't large or luxurious, but everything was well kept. The straight fences, reinforced roofs, and neatly stacked firewood spoke of a man who left nothing to chance. Kiona observed silently. She had seen many makeshift shacks and temporary camps, but this place had something different. It seemed built to endure, not just pass the time. Beckett dismounted and guided her toward the corral. He opened the stable door and offered her the interior space. "You can rest here first until you decide where you want to stay. I'm not setting rules except one. While you're under this roof, no one will lay a finger on you." Kiona looked at him directly, searching for signs of deceit. She found none. She neither smiled nor thanked him immediately. Her response was practical, like someone who had learned not to give trust away. "I'll see it with my own eyes." Beckett nodded without offense. To him, those words were reasonable. As she explored the stable interior, checking every corner like someone measuring possible exits, Beckett entered the house and returned minutes later with a couple of clean blankets and freshly baked bread. He left them on a wooden bench. "This is what there is. It's not much, but nothing's missing." Kiona took one of the blankets, spread it on the floor, and sat on it. She said nothing, but her eyes followed Beckett attentively. She had seen too many men show one face at first and another later. His so far was an imperturbable face, hard to read. As the day progressed, Beckett went out to the corral to feed the horses and chop wood. Every movement of his was filled with a disconcerting normalcy. He didn't try to impress, didn't watch her excessively, didn't seek forced conversation. He simply did what any man would do on his own property. For Kana, this was a dangerous novelty, a man who didn't show the typical signs of threat but whose calm could hide a deeper secret. That night, as the moon lit the prairies, Kiona understood something. Her destiny was no longer in the hands of those who had auctioned her, but neither was it fully in her own yet. What came next would depend on what this man, Beckett Shaw, chose to reveal over time. and the question hammering in her mind was just one: what did he truly want from her? The first night at the ranch was a silent challenge. Beckett prepared dinner in the kitchen: beans, bread, and some salted meat. He brought the food to the stable and left it on an improvised table. He didn't try to share the meal with her or force conversation. He understood Kiona needed space. She ate in silence, tasting each bite cautiously. It wasn't distrust of the food, but of the situation. She was used to every gesture from a man hiding a price. Here, however, Beckett merely did what he had promised: shelter and food, nothing more. When she finished, he collected the plates and left without a word. Kiona followed him with her eyes, trying to decipher him. She had seen many kinds of men, those who showed violence from the first moment and those who disguised it with smiles. Beckett was neither of those types, and that disturbed her more than outright hostility would have. In the early hours, Kiona heard footsteps in the corral. She shot up, knife in hand, ready to defend herself, but what she saw was Beckett going out with a lantern in one hand and a shotgun in the other. The man moved stealthily, checking the fence and the surroundings. He had seen something, or perhaps was just confirming no one from town was following them. She watched him from the shadows. It didn't seem like a show to impress her. Every gesture was natural, as if part of a routine he had repeated many times. This man was used to keeping watch at night, like someone who knows calm is never absolute. At dawn, Beckett appeared at the stable door and said in a direct tone, "I'm going to work in the field. If you want, you can stay here or come out to look around. No one gives orders in this house." Kiona raised an eyebrow. That phrase clashed with everything she had lived through in recent months. She didn't answer immediately, simply decided to accompany him. She followed him to the corral, where he began repairing a damaged fence. He used tools with precision, like someone who knows every nail and plank of his land. Kiona watched in silence, and in that silence she began to notice something unexpected. This man seemed to need company, though he didn't ask for it. After a while, she picked up one of the wooden planks and held it in place so he could drive the nails faster. Beckett looked up and observed her silently. He didn't say thank you or show exaggerated surprise, just nodded, as if acknowledging that this collaboration was not a favor but a free choice. They worked like that for hours, without too many words, until the fence was solid. Kiona wasn't used to a man accepting her help without mocking or belittling it. That small, real detail stuck with her. As they put the tools away, Beckett finally spoke. "The men who captured you aren't going to forget what happened at the auction. Sooner or later, one of them will try to claim what they think is theirs." Kiona clenched her fists. "I'm no one's." Beckett looked at her squarely. "And that's why you'll have to be ready. Here you won't be a slave, but you won't be free from danger either." It was the first time he openly acknowledged what both knew: the problem wasn't over. The auction might have ended, but the threat was just beginning. That night, Kiona lay in the stable and thought about everything she had seen in those first hours. A man who said little but did much, a place that offered refuge, though not guarantees, and an uncertain future that, for the first time in a long while, wasn't written by others. What she didn't yet know was that the next day would test everything: her endurance, Beckett's decision, and the shadow of those who didn't plan to let things rest. Second day at the ranch began with a different air. Beckett went out early to chop wood and check the hunting traps near the creek. Kiona, who had slept more peacefully than in weeks, got up before he returned. She walked the grounds, examining every corner in detail. It wasn't simple curiosity. She was evaluating exits, resources, and potential threats. She found fresh tracks near the north fence, boots at least 3 men. They weren't Beckett's. His footwear was different. Her heart quickened. She had suspected someone would follow them from the auction, but seeing those marks confirmed they didn't have much time before trouble knocked on the door. When Beckett returned with a couple of rabbits caught in the traps, Kiona waited for him at the stable entrance. "They're following us," she said bluntly, pointing to the tracks. Beckett set the animals on a table and bent to examine the trail. His eyes narrowed. "They're clumsy. If they wanted to hide, they wouldn't leave marks so clear." "Or they want us to know they're close," she countered. Beckett nodded gravely. It was exactly what he had thought. This wasn't silent pursuit, it was open intimidation. The day passed with contained tension. Beckett didn't change his routine. He fed the horses, fixed part of the roof, split wood, but he did so with his rifle always within reach. Kiona, instead of staying shut in, began to familiarize herself with the place. She practiced with the pistol he had given her, shooting at a dry log a few yards from the stable. Each shot was accurate. Beckett watched from a distance, neither correcting nor commenting. It wasn't necessary. He knew she had used a weapon before. As evening fell, while they put away the tools, a rider appeared on the horizon. He came slowly, as if announcing his arrival to avoid immediate attack. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a red neckerchief. When close enough, he raised his hand in a feigned, friendly greeting. "Evening, neighbor," he said with a crooked smile. "Heard in town you bought something interesting." Kiona felt a knot in her stomach. The man didn't speak of her as a person, but as goods. Beckett leaned on the fence, calm but with his hand very close to his revolver. "What you hear in town isn't your business." The stranger smiled wider, showing yellowed teeth. "Oh, but it is. That woman was part of a business, and some men aren't happy you took her." Kiona stepped forward, but Beckett stopped her with an almost imperceptible gesture. It was best not to provoke more than necessary. Tell them if they have something to claim, they can come themselves, Beckett replied with a firm voice, but bring papers because I have witnesses. The rider stared at him, trying to gauge his resolve. Finally, he spat on the ground and turned his horse. This isn't over, Shaw. Some businesses aren't forgotten so easily. When the man rode off, Kiona breathed deeply, relieved yet tense. They'll come back, I know, Beckett answered, adjusting his hat, but no one gets in here without going through me first. That day, Kiona understood something fundamental. Beckett hadn't bought her freedom to use it, but to protect it. And without intending to, he had put his own life on the line against the men who had reduced her to an object. The ranch's calm had ended. What came now would be a silent war against those who refused to accept losing what they considered theirs. The encounter with the red neckerchief rider made clear the danger was no longer a distant possibility, but a real threat. That night, Beckett took extra precautions, reinforced the stable locks, loaded all the weapons, and left a lantern burning in the cabin window as a warning that someone was awake. Kiona, instead of hiding, asked to stay in the house. She didn't want to be caught alone in the stable if the men decided to attack in the dark. Beckett didn't argue. He pointed to a blanket by the fire and left the shotgun propped against the wall within reach of both. For hours, silence reigned in the cabin, broken only by the crackling wood in the hearth. Beckett remained seated, sharpening a knife with slow, measured strokes. Kiona watched him closely. She saw no fear in him but concentration, like someone who knows violence could erupt at any moment and prefers to be ready. Around midnight, the horses began to stir. Their nervous whinnies came from the corral. Beckett raised his hand for Kiona to stay silent and moved to the window. 3 shadows moved in the distance among the trees. They came faster than I expected, he murmured. Kiona tightened her grip on the knife she always kept hidden. Fear was present, but not the fear of a victim, the fear of someone ready to fight. Beckett extinguished the lantern with a swift move and turned to her. Stay here. If they come in, shoot without asking. Kiona didn't argue, but neither did she stay passive. She took the shotgun and positioned herself behind the table where she'd have good cover. Her eyes gleamed in the dim light, resolute. Beckett went out the back door, moving silently like a hunter who knows every corner of his own land. Slipped behind the stable and waited. The intruders approached with clumsy steps, believing darkness gave them an advantage. There were 3, the red neckerchief rider and 2 others who seemed his accomplices. They carried ropes and short arms. They hadn't come to negotiate, they came to reclaim what they considered theirs. The red neckerchief whispered, "The old man's asleep. We go in fast and take her." But before he could give another order, a deep voice shattered the night. "You're not taking anything here." The group spun around and saw Beckett aiming his rifle at them from the stable's shadow. The tension became unbearable. For a moment, no one moved. "Put the gun down, Shaw," one of them said, trying to sound confident. "We don't want trouble." Beckett didn't blink. "Then leave." The red neckerchief let out a nervous laugh. "And if we do?" At that instant, from the cabin came the sound of a shotgun being cocked. The men turned their heads and saw Kiona in the window, aiming without trembling. Her face was lit by the hearth fire behind her, and her expression left no doubt. She was ready to fire. Beckett seized the confusion, stepped forward, and shouted with a firm voice, "Last chance. You leave now or this land becomes your grave." The intruders hesitated. They hadn't expected Kiona to be armed, nor Beckett to show such calm facing 3 men. Finally, the red neckerchief cursed under his breath, mounted his horse, and retreated, followed by the other 2. Beckett watched them ride off until the shadows disappeared over the horizon. Only then did he lower the rifle, re-enter the cabin, and find Kiona steady with the shotgun in position. She hadn't fired, but it was clear her hand wouldn't have trembled if she had. "You're not one to hang back," Beckett remarked with a slight tilt of his head. Kiona slowly lowered the weapon, but her eyes remained fierce. Never again. In that phrase, Beckett understood something. Kiona was not going to be a passive ward. She had decided that if she had to face threats, she would do so standing and armed, and that changed everything. What neither of them knew was that the retreat of those men didn't mean the end. It was only the beginning of a larger confrontation, because what was at stake was not just Kiona's freedom, but the dignity of challenging an entire system that had allowed that auction in the first place. The dawn after the attack left a heavy silence on the ranch. Beckett had barely slept, replaying the movements of the 3 men and calculating how long it would take them to return with reinforcements. Kiona, in turn, rested little but enough to make a decision. She no longer saw herself as a survivor dragged by circumstance, but as someone capable of responding. At sunrise, as Beckett prepared coffee in a pot blackened by smoke, Kiona approached with the shotgun still in hand. "They'll be back," she stated without preamble. "Yes," Beckett replied, pouring coffee into 2 metal cups, "and this time it won't be just 3. They sat face to face, sharing the most tense breakfast they'd had so far. Neither tried to sugarcoat reality. Both knew what had happened was just a warning. Later, Beckett saddled a horse and announced he would go to town. "Why?" Kiona asked, crossing her arms. "If those men spread the word that they'll reclaim what's theirs, the town needs to hear another version before things get twisted." Kiona understood the logic. In territories where law was fragile, public opinion could decide who was victim and who was guilty. Beckett rode toward Rollins with a steady pace. His horse's presence drew curious looks on the main street. Some men greeted him cautiously, others eyed him with suspicion, aware of the rumors already circulating. In the saloon, the sheriff was waiting. "I already heard," he said bluntly. "3 men tried to break into your ranch last night." Beckett nodded. "They didn't get in because I drove them off, but they'll be back." The sheriff, a man used to dealing with land and cattle disputes, knew this case was different. It involved an Apache woman auctioned in public and a rancher who had dared to defy the practice. Legal or not, it was gunpowder. "If this turns into an open fight," the sheriff warned, "no law will protect you. Many in this town still believe those auctions are fair." Beckett looked at him firmly. "I don't care what they believe. I'm not handing her over." The sheriff paused for a few seconds, then finally spoke. "Then get ready, because Shaw, those men don't give up easily, but neither do they." Meanwhile, at the ranch, Kiona took advantage of Beckett's absence to further explore the terrain. She checked the approaches, tested escape routes, and even hid a couple of weapons in strategic spots. She didn't fully trust the ranch's protection or the sheriff's silence. She knew that if the time came, she would have to fight for herself. As evening fell, Beckett returned. He brought supplies, but also worrying news. The rumor was already spreading in Rawlins. Some men said he had stolen a woman right out of an auction. Others accused him of wanting to start a conflict with the merchants who controlled the indigenous prisoner business. Kiona listened carefully, and when he finished, she said with a firm voice, "If they call me goods, then we have to show that I'm not." Beckett frowned. "What do you propose?" "That you don't hide me. If you treat me like someone hidden, they win. I want to stand in front so they know they won't break me." It was an unexpected challenge. Beckett looked at her in silence, recognizing that this woman who had arrived at his ranch as a victim of an auction was transforming into something else, an ally, perhaps even a force that could change everything. The decision was made. Neither would give in. But that determination would bring an inevitable consequence: war against a system that wouldn't accept losing power so easily. The day after the threat, Beckett made a decision that surprised Kiona. He wouldn't leave her at the ranch while he faced the rumors in town alone. "If they say you're my property, then they need to see you for what you really are, a free woman." Kiona didn't answer immediately. She knew going into Rawlins would mean exposing herself to looks heavy with prejudice and hate, but she also understood that hiding would only strengthen her enemy's version. So she nodded and prepared. Upon reaching town, the murmuring was immediate. The main street filled with stares fixed on them. Some men spat on the ground in contempt, others laughed maliciously, and a few women watched with a mix of curiosity and fear. The presence of an Apache woman walking beside a white rancher broke all the unspoken rules of that territory. Beckett headed to the saloon where rumors spread fastest. They entered together, the atmosphere tense like a string about to snap. The red neckerchief was there, accompanied by his 2 accomplices and several onlookers. When he saw them enter, his crooked smile twisted into a venomous grimace. "Look at him," he shouted mockingly. "The great Beckett Shaw thinks he can buy an Indian and turn her into a lady." Laughter erupted, but not everyone laughed with the same force. Some men looked down, uncomfortable. There was a difference between joking in private and witnessing public humiliation. Kiona, instead of lowering her head, stepped forward. Her voice rang out firm. "I am no one's property. I wasn't bought, I was freed." Silence fell instantly. No one expected her to speak, much less with such confidence. The red neckerchief rose from his chair, furious. "Shut up, Indian, you have no voice here." Beckett stepped forward, placing himself between them, but Kiona stopped him with a gesture. She didn't need him to speak for her. "I've had enough imposed silence," she said, looking directly into the man's eyes. "I won't shut up again." Some patrons murmured among themselves. This was unusual. Not everyone agreed with the auctioning of indigenous people, but until then, no one had dared to challenge it head-on. The sheriff, also present, raised his voice to cut the tension. "Enough, private disputes won't be settled here." His tone was firm, but everyone understood the message. If the conflict got out of hand in town, he would intervene. Yet it was also clear that beyond that warning, everyone would have to defend their own position. Beckett took Kiona's arm, not to control her, but to guide her toward the exit. As they left, stares still followed them. They hadn't won any definitive battle, but they had left a mark. Kiona had spoken in front of everyone, and those words, so simple yet so powerful, would begin to divide opinions in town. On the way back to the ranch, Beckett said in a low voice, "Today you changed everything. It's no longer my word against theirs. Now it's your voice against their silence." Kiona looked toward the horizon with tight lips. She knew what she had done not only exposed her more, but put both their lives at risk. Yet she also understood it was the only way to break the chain of humiliations they had tried to impose on her. What neither of them knew was that the words spoken in the saloon would soon reach the ears of men with more power than simple ranchers, merchants, politicians, and authorities, unwilling to let an act of rebellion threaten a business as profitable as the auction of indigenous prisoners. Kiona's "this response is AI generated for reference only."